Marco Ebben, known in cartel circles as El Hollanda, disappeared into the brutal underworld of Mexico, a realm where only the most ruthless survive. Driven by an insatiable thirst for power, Marco pushed boundaries that few would dare cross. Far from his origins in Schiedam, he became immersed in the most violent cartel networks in Mexico, a life worlds apart from his homeland. Yet his ambition led him deeper, into a world far darker and far more dangerous. In 2015, Marco's criminal career took a dramatic turn when he and his father Henk were arrested for attempting to smuggle 400 kilos of cocaine into the Netherlands. The drugs were concealed in pineapple shipments. After a brief prison stint, Marco went underground in 2019, marking the start of his life on the run. From minor smuggling operations, he transformed into a high-profile fugitive with connections reaching deep into global crime networks. Each move drew him deeper into a life from which there was no turning back. In the Netherlands, Marco's story of rapid transformation stunned many. Once a familiar figure in Schiedam, his reputation quickly expanded across Europe. By 2023, his name appeared on Europol's most wanted list, elevating him to an international threat. Sightings of him surfaced in Mexico, solidifying his status as far more than a simple fugitive. However, his last known sighting plunged his status into ambiguity. While embroiled in underworld conflicts, news broke of his death, sparking widespread shock. But had he truly died? Or is it merely a ruse, a calculated move to escape law enforcement? According to De Telegraaf, Marco's fate remains uncertain. Neither Dutch nor Mexican authorities have confirmed his death, and his photo still appears on Europol's most wanted list. Reportedly, the police are still considering the possibility that Marco is alive, hiding in plain sight, under the radar. His story, marked by swift movements and shifting identities, raises questions that reach beyond borders. How did Marco Ebben, a man from the quiet streets of Schiedam, become so deeply entangled in battles far from home? And how had he managed, despite international pursuit, to remain one step ahead, navigating through countries that offered him both sanctuary and danger, only to be defeated by death shortly after? His life reveals a hidden side of international crime, one that defies expectation and shows how figures like Ebben can evolve, moving deeper into the shadows. The story of Marco Ebben begins in the Netherlands, where he grew up under the shadow of crime, his father a notorious figure in the Rotterdam underworld. Henk Ebben, sometimes compared to the infamous Dutch criminal Willem Holleeder, called the Rotterdamse Holleeder, was a key player in narcotic trafficking. As the son of a feared Rotterdam criminal, Marco learned from his father Henk not only the ins and outs of smuggling, but also how to survive in the harsh underworld. With Henk by his side, Marco received hands-on training in crime, eventually leading him down a path of constant risk and deception. Together, they operated a network that trafficked vast quantities of coke into the Netherlands. During this time, Marco learned the tricks and secrets of the underworld at his father's heels, becoming a cunning trafficker and criminal. Imagine him as someone who was once seen as a promising talent, but who also faced some of the most intense situations at a young age alongside his father. Even back then, you could tell he was drawn to thrill-seeking. Otherwise, he wouldn't have ended up in Mexico. It was as if he was always chasing the next rush. In the period 2014 to 2015, Marco Ebben, together with co-suspects, smuggled a total of 400 kilograms of coke into the Netherlands. In order to hide the true contents of the containers, they had filled the containers with pineapples. Many likewise trafficking operations occurred alongside. Both father and son landed in jail in 2015 as suspects for this case, but Dutch authorities were watching, and in 2020, after years of evasion, Marco was convicted, sentenced to 7 years in prison. Unlike his father, who served time for his crimes, Marco saw an opportunity and vanished, slipping into the shadows and evading the authorities who sought him. By 2023, his continued evasion earned him a spot on Europol's most wanted list, cementing his reputation as a high-profile fugitive. People were encouraged to share tips about these criminals. But Marco wasn't hiding in the seemingly quiet streets of Europe. Reports soon began filtering in that he was spotted in Mexico, aligning with Ismael Zambada Sicaros, known as El Maito Flaco, leader of the La Maeza faction of the Sinaloa Cartel. For those who knew Marco only as a coke smuggler, this was an unexpected twist. He was now believed to be fighting in Mexico's brutal cartel wars, supporting Zambada's faction, La Maiza, against Los Chapitos, the sons of notorious narcotic lord Joaquim El Chapo Guzman. Mexican authorities found themselves stunned by this foreign figure appearing in the ranks of La Maiza, a man who, only a few years earlier, had operated in the Dutch narcotic underworld. Marco's shift from Rotterdam smuggler to a Mexican cartel enforcer reflects not only his resourcefulness, but also his surprising adaptation to a world far removed from his origins. Marco wasn't merely on the run from the law, he was searching for something else, a thrill, an adrenaline rush that only danger could provide. It was as if he was destined to seek out danger, regardless of the consequences. The chase for him had become a multinational effort, with Europol tracking his every move across continents. But with each sighting, from Russia to Turkey and now Mexico, he stayed one step ahead, weaving himself deeper into the violent world of the Sinaloa Cartel's power struggle. It is no longer the story of a local smuggler. It is the tale of a fugitive who has reinvented himself in one of the most dangerous criminal landscapes in the world. Marco Ebben's entry into the world of crime was anything but subtle. By his early 20s, Marco had already established himself within the ranks of a notorious narcotic trafficking network known as the Schiedam Coke Mafia. This was no minor gang. The Schiedam Mafia was a formidable organisation deeply embedded in Rotterdam's criminal underworld, notorious for its brazen smuggling operations and fierce reputation. Marco was no outsider here. His father, Henk Ebben, was a key player, often regarded as a major figure in Dutch organised crime circles. Operating under his father's guidance, Marco became instrumental in a trafficking operation that would send ripples across Europe's law enforcement agencies. In 2015, their coke shipments were nothing short of grand, reaching a scale that drew significant attention from authorities. Marco, along with his father and others in their network, devised a method that was as creative as it was criminal. One of their more infamous schemes, they transported 400 kilograms of coke from Brazil to the Netherlands, concealing the haul in containers filled with pineapples. Now, why pineapples? And why did this tactic turn out to be highly effective? It exploited the fact that in the food import industry, fruit shipments like pineapples are often subject to minimal inspection, allowing the Ebben network to bypass authorities with relative ease. This wasn't a one-time operation, but rather part of a larger trafficking infrastructure that Marco and his father controlled. They had ties with the Rotterdam port, facilitated by bribed officials who helped ensure shipments passed through customs undisturbed. Among them was Customs Officer Gerrit G, whose assistance proved invaluable to the Ebben network. For a price, Gerrit G ensured that containers like the pineapple shipments went unchecked, giving Marco and his father nearly free rein over their smuggling operations. It was through these tactics and connections that the Schiedam Coke Mafia managed to funnel vast amounts of the product into Europe, supplying a thriving demand and expanding their influence in the illicit trade. Yet, even the most well-oiled criminal operations have cracks. Dutch authorities began to catch wind of the Ebben's activities, mounting a case against the Schiedam Coke Mafia through months of undercover surveillance, intelligence gathering and wiretaps. Their breakthrough came with the wiretapping of Marco's luxurious Rotterdam rental villa, an operation that revealed key conversations and logistics, ultimately exposing the scale of his and his father's trafficking enterprise. However, for a year and a half before that, the investigative services had been monitoring Marco and his father Henk. By 2015, both Marco and Henk were arrested, facing charges that shook the organisation to its core. For a time, they found themselves behind bars, with Marco staring down a lengthy sentence. In this time, the father-son duo was put in solitary confinement due to allegations that they were planning to escape and eliminate another major narcotic criminal. This pissed off Henk, as it turned out later that the liquidation story was unfounded. In January 2016, the possibility of release for Marco Ebben arose. He would be allowed to await his trial related to large-scale narcotic trafficking in freedom if he paid a bail of €25,000. The public prosecutor deemed this amount too low and pushed for the bail of €500,000, based on the millions that he was alleged to have earned from drug trafficking. To this day, it remains unclear whether Ebben was actually released during this period or not. After lengthy court proceedings, Henk was sentenced to 14 years, while Marco was sentenced to 6 years in 2017. In 2020, Marco's sentence increased, following an appeal against the sentencing, to 7 years and 7 months. The judge found that his share of narcotic smuggling was greater than expected. Henk's sentence was reduced to 11 years and 4 months. The conviction was a victory for Dutch authorities. but it would soon prove to be a temporary one. Awaiting further hearings, Marco seized the chance to flee. Instead of serving his sentence, he vanished, slipping into hiding and re-emerging only sporadically on the authorities' radar. By November 2023, his ability to evade capture and continue his involvement in criminal activities earned him a place on Europol's most wanted list, marking him as one of Europe's highest priority fugitives. In just a few short years, Marco's criminal profile had transformed significantly. From being a player in a localized Dutch crime network, he became a transnational fugitive. The authorities had little choice but to track his movements across multiple borders, all while the Schiedam coke mafia continued to crumble under the weight of pressure. In 2019, as Marco Ebben awaited the outcome of his appeal, he decided not to take any chances with Dutch justice. Instead of facing the prospect of prison, Marco took flight, slipping out of the Netherlands and disappearing into the vast web of international hideouts available to those with the right connections and resources. His escape was not an impulsive decision, but a carefully orchestrated move, reflecting a calculated effort to stay ahead of authorities who were closing in on his operations. Yet Marco's life on the run was far from idyllic. Despite his best efforts to stay under the radar, he quickly became a target, not just for authorities, but also for enemies he had accumulated in his criminal career. One of the most notable incidents occurred in May 2020, along the A4 motorway near Schiphol Airport. A black Range Rover speeding through the A4, Marco sensed danger. Shots rang out. He escaped, but just barely. The car trailing him, a BMW, was relentless, following him as he swerved and accelerated to evade his pursuer, up to 200 km per hour. He swerved off the highway, but the pursuer wasn't to leave him alone. According to Marco, he faced an attack from the BMW driver, his vehicle peppered with shots. Finally, Marco managed to throw him off. During this time, he called the emergency number to report that he was under attack from automatic weapons. The authorities came at once for help, but didn't find the BMW, nor could they find any concrete traces of the shots. However, they escorted the man home without realizing that they were helping out the man they were so keenly looking for. Later, the criminal intelligence team found that the Amsterdam criminals may have sought to eliminate Ebben for ripping off 21 kilos of coke. For most, such an incident might serve as a wake-up call. But for Marco, this was just one of many close calls that would mark his life on the run. Undeterred, he moved abroad. The places Marco chose as his sanctuaries, Dubai, Russia, Turkey and Italy, were far from arbitrary. Each offered distinct advantages for a fugitive in his position. Dubai, with its sprawling luxury districts and a reputation as a magnet for wealthy expatriates, was one of his earliest stops. It was also dubbed a criminal's haven at that time. The city's bustling, transient population allowed Marco to blend in while enjoying a lifestyle that Dutch authorities would have a hard time disrupting. From Dubai, he could operate in relative safety, using his network to maintain his influence in the narcotic trade without fear of immediate extradition. He then surfaced in Russia. There he reportedly stayed with his girlfriend's family, occasionally granting interviews to Dutch media outlets while keeping his identity obscured behind a black balaclava. Marco's defiance was as evident as ever. In one interview, he dismissed his legal troubles as old grumbling, no longer relevant, underscoring his refusal to acknowledge the charges that kept him on Europol's most wanted list. But Russia proved no safer than his previous hideouts. By June 2024, Marco had relocated once again, this time to Turkey. There, his life took another perilous turn when his convoy of 3 cars was ambushed by 4 men on motorcycles, armed with automatic weapons. In the ensuing fight, bullets ricocheted off vehicles and Marco was hit by shrapnel, sustaining injuries to his ribcage and hand. He spent 5 days recovering in a Turkish hospital, a reminder that his flight from justice was not without its dangers. Despite the close calls and attempts on his life, Marco's resilience as a fugitive was unshaken. He remained a constant presence on Europol's most wanted list, each attempt to capture him only reinforcing his determination to evade those who pursued him. Marco Ebben, once a Dutch criminal under his father's wing, was now a seasoned fugitive, navigating the deadly intersections of organised crime and law enforcement across countries, continents and conflict. The name Marco Ebben has become almost synonymous with violence and intimidation. But among the most baffling chapters in this story are the repeated incidents involving a Vlaardingen plumber named Ron van Uffelen. Over the course of more than a year, Van Uffelen's home was repeatedly targeted by explosions, incidents that rattled his quiet neighbourhood and drew media attention. As the attacks escalated, suspicions began pointing towards Ebben, whose reputation and alleged involvement in organised crime made him a prime suspect. However, Ebben himself denied any connection to these events. According to Van Uffelen, his troubles began with a seemingly ordinary bar scuffle. 4 years earlier, in Café Rotterdam, he recalled having a heated exchange with an individual he later came to believe was Marco Ebben. In the aftermath, Van Uffelen provided the authorities with a list of names of those he suspected might have a vendetta against him. Marco's name appeared on the list, though Van Uffelen admitted he wasn't 100% sure of his involvement. As attacks on his property continued, Van Uffelen grew even more certain that Ebben might be behind the violence, yet remained open to the idea that he could be mistaken. But according to Marco, "Listen, I've never seen, spoken to, or anything with that good man in my life. I don't know him, and I've never fought. No one has ever hit me. I don't go to bars either because I don't drink, smoke, or use drugs. I'm a very sporty guy." Marco was unwavering in his assertion that he had no link to the plumber and labelled the accusations as a smear born from his surname and reputation. To him, the rumours and repeated attempts to connect him to acts of violence he claimed no part in were more than just a nuisance. They were part of what he described as a witch hunt. The attacks on Van Uffelen's home, he insisted, had 0.0 evidence pointing towards him. Even more perplexing, rumours circulated that after the attack, Marco landed in a ditch with his electric Jaguar. Marco denied this incident as well, stating it was pure fabrication, part of a narrative that seemed to take on a life of its own. The more the allegations spread, the more Marco felt targeted, not just by authorities, but by the media as well. He believed that any incident involving violence or an unsolved crime was, by default, linked back to him, with little evidence to justify it. Marco also said that he was sad about the explosions. If you have problems with someone, he stated, you should solve it with that person yourself, and not bother his mother or brother. These people have nothing to do with it. But yes, the Netherlands has changed, right? Through these denials and his appeals to the public, Marco Ebben painted himself as a man wronged by circumstance and hounded by his family's reputation. To him, the claims were baseless rumours and the product of an unjust vendetta against him, and a symbol of the price he had paid for simply being an Ebben. When Marco Ebben vanished from the European authorities' radar, few could have predicted where he would resurface. But as reports filtered through from Culiacán, Mexico, it became clear that he hadn't just disappeared, he had transformed. No longer just a Dutch fugitive, Ebben was now allegedly a soldier in one of the world's most violent criminal organisations, the Sinaloa Cartel. He had aligned himself with La Maeza, a faction led by Ismael Zambada Sicaros, known as El Mayito Flaco, son of the veteran cartel boss Ismael El Mayo Zambada. In a twist that shocked Dutch authorities, Marco Ebben was reported to be fighting side by side with cartel operatives, thrust into the bloody internal conflict that tore the Sinaloa Cartel apart. Reports indicate that Ebben allegedly commanded an armed militia of 50 men under El Mayo, solidifying his role within the faction and his deep involvement in the cartel's violent power struggle. Culiacán, often regarded as the cartel's unofficial capital, was the epicenter of these escalating conflicts. In recent years, tensions between the sons of Joaquim El Chapo Guzman, collectively known as Los Chapitos, and Zambada's La Maeza faction had reached a fever pitch. For reasons that remain unclear, Ebben's allegiance fell to Zambada, and soon the Dutch criminal, a stranger in a strange land, was spotted actively participating in armed confrontations. To those familiar with his past, this was a radical shift, from a European smuggler moving coke through Dutch ports to an active participant in Mexico's violent cartel wars. It's unclear how he adapted to the brutal dynamics of cartel warfare, but sources painted a picture of a man fully absorbed into the lifestyle, from wearing military-style uniforms to engaging in armed skirmishes. By September 2024, reports surfaced that he had been involved in a significant confrontation where La Maeza forces clashed violently with rival groups. In the chaos, Ebben was allegedly wounded, though details were murky. Some accounts claimed he sustained injuries that left him bleeding heavily, while others hinted at his possible death in the firefight. John van den Heuvel, a Dutch crime reporter, even noted having seen images of a severely injured, bloodied Ebben after the fire exchange. This development seemed to corroborate stories from local sources, which described the scene as chaotic, with fatalities on both sides. Yet, even with these graphic reports, Ebben's fate remained ambiguous. Was he alive, hiding, or dead? To complicate matters further, his family had received no communication from him since the fight, intensifying their concerns for his well-being but then his friends and family confirmed his death as well. Adding to the uncertainty, Amsterdam rapper Jagger Jagger, currently serving an 18-year sentence for elimination, posted a tribute on Instagram that seemed to confirm Ebben's death. "Rest in peace, warrior Marco Ebben," read the post, accompanied by an image of Ebben holding a weapon, surrounded by masked men clad in military-style gear. The tribute implied that Ebben had indeed perished in Mexico's violent cartel conflict, though official confirmation remains elusive. Meanwhile, official sources suggested that the possibility of this announcement was yet another smokescreen, designed to keep Ebben safely out of reach. The trajectory of Marco Ebben's criminal career highlights a rare and unsettling fusion of local European crime networks with the brutal cartel wars of Mexico. Ebben's story also brings forward the limitations of international law enforcement when dealing with figures who maneuver skillfully across countries with little regard for borders. Europol's most wanted designation kept Ebben's name in the spotlight, yet his movement from one sanctuary to another, Dubai, Russia, Turkey, and eventually Mexico, points to the continued challenges of extradition, enforcement, and even identification in transnational crime. The conflicting reports about his fate after the shootout reflect these gaps. Whether he remains active or is now a ghost of the cartel war, Ebben's tale shows the complex, far-reaching consequences when localized crime figures insert themselves into global criminal conflicts. But without official confirmation, Ebben's fate remains a mystery. His lawyer refrained from validating any claims, telling Dutch media that he'd not been in direct contact with Ebben since the shootout. The authorities echoed this uncertainty. "It could be that he has died, but it could be a trick to stay under our radar," a source told De Telegraaf, acknowledging that Ebben's reported death might yet be another strategy to avoid capture. However, Marco's father has confirmed the death. He was found in a morgue by his Russian girlfriend. According to her, he had a gunshot wound in his head. The family believes the story and is sure that the Rotterdammer is no longer among them. Ebben's father also told the media that the girlfriend wants to have Marco Ebben's body transferred to Russia and buried there. Ebben is said to have travelled to Mexico on a Russian passport. Earlier, there were still doubts among family and friends because authorities in the Netherlands and Mexico did not confirm the death. Where exactly the body is located is still unclear. According to Henk Ebben, Rotterdam detectives visited his family in recent days for more information, such as an official death certificate. The authorities are still unsure that Ebben is alive and is just creating a facade to stay under the radar and avoid justice. His name and photo are still present on the most wanted list of the European police organisation Europol. Henk Ebben, who himself was convicted of narcotic and violent crimes in the past, said in a telephone interview that he was in mourning. "I no longer doubt that I've lost my son. Marco was also crazy about weapons and did not avoid dangerous situations despite warnings. He said he was convinced that he would not make it to 30 years. I hope that we can say goodbye to his body." According to Henk, he is angry that the authorities keep approaching him. "They should leave us alone." Henk Ebben has completed a long prison term and spent 5 years in the Extra Secure Institute in Wout. This was another source of resentment for Marco, according to whom his father was an old man of 72. He had served his sentence and should be left alone for once. Notably, Henk was also linked to 5 eliminations and sentenced to life imprisonment, but on appeal the sentence was reduced to 18 years. Marco Ebben would still have to serve the remainder of the 7-year sentence, and there is also another investigation into him. Marco Ebben resurfaced in Russia and Turkey in the past 2 years, where he was injured in a firing. According to his father, he then left for Mexico, where father and son Ebben have good contacts in criminal organisations. However, Marco said in an interview that he had family in Russia who looked after him. He denied criminal links, saying, "Let's just leave it at that." He added that any more information on the subject would be of interest to the investigators, and the last thing he wanted was his relatives being bothered by authorities for nothing. Marco joined confidants of one of the leaders of the Sinaloa Cartel, Ismael Zambada, alias El Mayo. He drove with heavily armed henchmen into an ambush by soldiers of competitor El Chapo. In the fight that followed, Ebben was reportedly fatally wounded. A fierce battle has been raging in Sinaloa for weeks between gangs of El Chapo and El Mayo, after the latter was kidnapped to the US by one of El Chapo's sons and handed over to US authorities. Let's take a little detour from our subject and get a glimpse of this happening war going on in Mexico. Marco Ebben's story stands as a dark testament to the unpredictable evolution of organised crime figures who deftly maneuver through an increasingly interconnected world. From his roots as a young man admonished in the Schiedam coke mafia, to his status as an alleged hitman in the brutal power struggles of the Sinaloa Cartel, Ebben has continually adapted, evading capture through a mix of calculated moves and strategic alliances. His life illustrates a rare transformation, one that saw him shift from European smuggler to active participant in a cartel war, taking on a new identity as El Hollanda in the violent arena of Culiacan, Mexico. Each chapter of Ebben's journey reveals a figure deeply skilled at exploiting the grey areas between legal jurisdictions. His path across borders, from Dubai to Russia, Turkey and finally Mexico, illustrates not just his personal determination to remain free, but also the growing challenge international law enforcement agencies face in an era where criminals operate across borders with ease. His ability to modify his appearance, travel on a Russian passport, and take refuge in countries with limited extradition arrangements to the Netherlands speaks volumes about the difficulties law enforcement agencies encounter when apprehending high-profile fugitives. Even after being placed on Europol's most wanted list in 2023, Ebben remained elusive, each reported sighting adding to his legend but not bringing him any closer to arrest. Ebben's alleged involvement in cartel violence in Mexico has significant implications for the landscapes of international crime. His presence in Culiacan symbolises how European criminals are finding way into conflicts far from home, drawn by the enormous power and profit that Mexico's cartels wield. Law enforcement agencies worldwide are left to ponder at what it means when local figures in organised crime become assets in distant cartel wars. Ebben's journey suggests that cartel violence has an expanding reach, and that allegiances between criminals of different nationalities are not just possible, but actively pursued. It's a development that complicates global law enforcement efforts and heightens the risk of international crime syndicates merging in ways that were once unthinkable. Marco Ebben's story also underscores the frustrating limitations that agencies like Europol and Interpol face. Tracking a figure like Ebben across multiple countries requires unprecedented cooperation, not only between nations, but also across agencies that often operate within rigid, country-specific protocols. Despite high-priority status, Ebben managed to evade the combined forces of international law enforcement, navigating some of the most surveilled regions in the world, while under the watchful eye of Europol. His success in avoiding capture may point to vulnerabilities in global crime tracking frameworks, which were largely built for a world where criminals operated within the borders of their own countries. With Ebben's flight, it became clear that these structures may require reform to match the transnational nature of today's organised crime. Has he truly met his end? Or is this just a masterful ruse to stay permanently out of justice's reach? With no conclusive evidence, Marco Ebben's fate remains shrouded in mystery.